Hi everybody and welcome back to Exotics of the World TV. Now in this episode we're going to be talking about the basic care of crested geckos. So sit back, relax and enjoy the rest of the video. So to kick us off we're going to talk about the animal's country of origin. So where do they come from? These little geckos are endemic to the island of New Caledonia, which is located near like Fiji, Australia, around about there. In this environment there are lots of trees and shrubs, so let's try and replicate that in our enclosures. Now we would typically class crested geckos as arboreal animals, so this means that they do like to climb. So crested geckos have a fantastic little adaptation, these little sticky pads on their feet which can literally make them climb any surface. So in the UK, it is recommended that crested geckos are kept in a 45 by 45 by 60 tall enclosure. So if you want to go bigger, you can do. It's something that we would recommend. These animals will utilize all the space. So if you want to go 3 foot tall, 4 foot tall, if you want to go 2 foot wide, if you want to go 3 foot wide, that kind of thing, you can do so. We would also recommend that you house them singularly. If you do want to experiment with cohabitation, please make sure that you do your research beforehand. It's not something we would recommend a novice embark on. So some people have had great success with cohabitation and some people haven't. So it really is going to depend on your ability. So as said previously, it's not something we would recommend for the beginner or the general novice. Crested geckos in captivity can be a little bit messy. What you'll tend to find is that they'll do their business quite often all over the glass. So you will need to keep on top of that because sometimes if it stays there for a long time, it can smell. Also, just be aware that when you're spraying water, if you're in a hard water area, you will get lime scale on the glass. So just again, make sure that you're just getting rid of that as much as you possibly can. You can get around this by using RO water or reverse osmosis water. You can get this from most like marine shops, but we like to also use rainwater as well. That is distilled and nice and clean. If you're not having your animal in a bioactive setup, then when it comes to cleaning, we would typically say do it as soon as you see a bit of feces. So or any like shed skin, any dead insects, any like food items that the animal's not eaten or smeared like all over the glass, just make sure it's clean. So you're keeping on top of like your spot cleaning. The better you are at keeping on top of this, the longer you'll have between full cleans. Now, full clean, it's completely up to you. Like with most animals, we would typically say do a full clean once every like 2 to 4 months or so. Now this doesn't include if you have bioactive enclosures, but I think I'll do a separate video on bioactive enclosures. So another really important topic that quite often a lot of people do get wrong is in fact heating. Now people will typically say that just to have the animal at room temperature, so in the UK room temperature is around about 18 degrees or so. This is something we wouldn't really say to do. Crested geckos do need it a little bit warmer than that. Not too much warmer, but just a little bit warmer. So the minimum in the day that we would recommend to go down to would be about 22 degrees. The maximum air temperature would be around about 27. Now, crested geckos do need basking spots, all right? But you wouldn't use the same kind of basking spots as you would do for like larger animals, okay? You're gonna want to use a smaller bulb. So we use things like the Lucky Reptile mini halogens. So I find personally that these do create a really nice warm basking spot, but only in a small area of the enclosure. Now, if your enclosure is bigger, then this is going to be achieved a lot easier. But as with all heating systems, we would definitely recommend the use of a thermostat. So the actual temperature of the basking spot, we would say to be around about 30, 32. You're not going to want to go over that too much. You don't want to get crispy fried crested gecko. Now, all too often when it concerns humidity, we find that, again, people tend to get this wrong quite a lot, okay? So crested geckos, great. So crested geckos do need a fairly humid enclosure. We would recommend anywhere from around about 60 to 90%. Anywhere in between there is absolutely fine. Again, as I've said in previous videos, your humidity is going to peak and trough. Now, your substrate that you have in there is going to really help regulate that humidity actually in there. But where people go wrong is they tend to spray the enclosure far too often, and the substrate becomes waterlogged. It can get quite boggy, then bacteria can then start breeding, then sometimes fungal spores will take a hold of the enclosure and you get like fungal infestations, and it can just be a bit of a mess. Okay, if you're sticking to your spraying twice, 3 times a day, just a quite light, nice little spritz, then you should be absolutely fine. You can also get around this by using like rain systems and stuff. There are some really good rain systems out there. So of course, Mist King is by far one of the better ones, but surprisingly, one that I do really like using is the Habitat Rainmaker. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. If it's not, I'll pop the actual name somewhere down there. So the Habitat Rainmaker is a lot cheaper than the Mist King. It's still an expensive piece of equipment, but it's still a lot cheaper, and you can get near enough the same results. They're actually a really good piece of kit. Now, there are other brands that are available. However, some of these just aren't that great. What I tend to find is that they break, the replacement parts are a little bit expensive, that kind of thing. But in general, I've not had any problems with Mist King or the Habitat one. So I touched on this topic a little bit earlier in the video, and this is your thermostats. So your thermostat is going to help control the temperature inside the enclosure. Now, a thermostat will have 3 wires that are coming off it. One will plug straight into the mains, so straight into your wall. One of them is a little outlet, and this is where you're going to plug your heating actually into it. And then the third one is the probe. So the probe is going to go inside the enclosure around where the basking spot is. So another vital piece of equipment that we definitely would recommend having inside this enclosure would be thermometers. So you can tell what temperature it is inside the enclosure. Now, thermostats and thermometers do completely separate things. I mean, some of the more fancy thermostats will be able to tell you the temperature, but some of the old analog kind of ones that you have to like do on with a dial won't do. So it's really important that you do have thermometers in there as well. Now, remember the temperatures that I've just previously said and act accordingly. What you can also pop in there as well is a hygrometer. So this is going to tell you how humid it is. Now, when people spray, it's going to naturally go up and then it'll go down after a bit when you stop spraying. This is completely normal. It doesn't mean the humidity is dropping like ridiculously in there, but just wait. If you can take average readings of that during the day, I don't know, maybe like 4 to 6 times a day, sometimes more if you want to, it's completely up to you, then you'll get a better overall picture. If you're still having issues with your humidity inside your enclosure, just pop inside a reptile specialist store and they will be able to help you out with it. Maybe give you some tips if you're missing something, that type of thing. Another piece of equipment that you can add to your arsenal is a temperature gun. Now, this is just going to give you surface temperature readings. It's not going to give you ambient or anything like that, so don't get a little bit het up when you see it's reading like quite hot. As long as the overall ambient temperature is fine, then you'll be all gravy. But it's a good piece of kit to have nonetheless. So, what other forms of lighting do I need to have inside my enclosure? So, UVB is a vital piece of equipment that we recommend all reptiles have access to. So crested geckos, even in this day and age, still do not have access quite a lot of the time to UVB. Now, we don't sell any vertebrate animal here without any form of UVB. So all our animals are nice and safe. So crested geckos can get metabolic bone disease. Now, the reason why people don't have the UVB in with the crested geckos is because they are still being told a lot of what we would call folklore husbandry. So they're nocturnal, they don't come out during the day, they're not exposed to the sun, they don't need it, etc, etc. Now, this simply is not true. Crested geckos have in fact been documented out in the wild, on logs, on branches, on trees, during the day, soaking up nice UVB, as well as heat. So crested geckos do need UVB, so it can work quite nicely with the calcium and multivitamin supplements that we give them, and it basically stops them from getting a myriad of different diseases. But the main one that we typically talk about in the reptile community is the dreaded metabolic bone disease. Now, I think we'll probably do a separate video on the D3 cycle and metabolic bone disease. So in this, I'm just going to keep it short and concise and just to the actual care of the crested gecko itself. So just like the leopard gecko, crested geckos are a Ferguson zone 1 to sometimes 2 animal. So if you just have a look on the back of a UVB bulb, it will be able to tell you in Ferguson zones, and then you'll be able to have your appropriate placement inside your enclosure. Now, another form of lighting that we highly would recommend that you have inside the enclosure is in fact LED lighting. Now, if you want to move over more to a bioactive enclosure, so things like with live plants, bugs and stuff in the substrate, that kind of thing, the LED is going to massively help your plant growth. Now, we would typically recommend using the Jungle Dawn LED bar, the New Dawn, along I think Zoomed do one potentially as well. I will have to double check on that one, but yeah. So add those inside the enclosure. It's going to be beneficial not only to your animal, but to your plants as well. So why is it going to be beneficial to my crepuscular, nocturnally kind of animal? So I'm glad you asked. So these guys do need to have, one, an appropriate day and night cycle. So it's going to help with that. So 12 hours on, 12 hours off. It's going to let that animal know, okay, awake time, asleep time, that kind of thing. It's also going to be able to let your animal see better. Now, I know it looks like quite bright when obviously we pop the UV bulbs and the basking spot bulbs in there, that type of thing. But compared to the outside, it's quite dim. So the more of the sun spectrum that we can hit inside the enclosure, in my opinion, the better off. So I'm quite happy that in the reptile community, most people do tend to use things like cocoa fibers as substrate. We don't really tend to see anything like the awful, gross reptile carpet or like lino tissue paper, that kind of thing. Maybe tissue paper if the animal's sick or if you've just got babies, that type of thing. But in general, for like juveniles, subadults, adults, most people tend to use cocoa fiber. And this is a perfectly good substrate to use. There are others that you can use as well. So I always like to mix my substrates. So when I'm doing like crested gecko environments, I always like to mix cocoa fiber with topsoil and then the Zoomed Reptisoil and then the Arcadia earth mix as well. I like to mix all of those in. For me personally, I feel that it gives a really nice kind of like jungly kind of look. And as well, if you're going to put live plants in there, it's going to supercharge those plants from the earth mix and indeed from the Reptisoil by Zoomed as well. So moving on to decor. So decor for me is always a strange one. I think it's down to people's personal taste, personal choices, that type of thing. Me, as I've said before, I'm a natural bug. I prefer live plants. I like logs, sticks, branches. I like leaf litter on the floor, mosses, that kind of thing. So that's my kind of shtick, if you like. If you want to put, I don't know, like a Star Wars 8080 in there or do like a themed enclosure, then that's absolutely fine. As long as the animal can interact with those ornaments in a safe way and it isn't going to harm them, then it's absolutely fine to use. But personally, to me, it's not something I quite like. I like mine very, very, very natural. So if you go into your local reptile store, which is definitely something we'd recommend doing. Reptile stores all across the UK and indeed all across the world do need your help to stay open. They should have a nice selection of ornaments. They should have a nice selection of live plants, branches, that type of thing. So let's talk about the animal's diet. So this is really, really important. So one of the main reasons I find when people come into the store and they speak to me about crested geckos, they go, well, they only need to be fed on like the paste kind of stuff. So your Pangea, Rapaces, Blue River diets, that type of thing. You're like, in a sense, complete diet. They only need to be fed on those. So it's absolutely fine. This isn't true. They do need to have live insects within their diet. So not only to hit certain like nutritional requirements, but also for enrichment as well. So different live food items will employ different hunting techniques by your animal, so thus enriching that animal's mind. All right, so it will employ a different hunting tactic from a locust to potentially a cricket to even things like soldier flies. So if you get calcium worms and you let them pupate into flies, I quite often do that. Curly wings as well, blue bottles, all sorts of bits and bobs like that. The more wide variety you can feed your animal in terms of live food, the better it's going to be for it. Now, the other side of that is the pre-mixes, all right? So I've mentioned a few brands already. So you've got Pangea, you've got Rapashi, you've got Blue River Diets. I'm pretty sure Habitat do one as well. Personally, to me, I prefer using Blue River. I like to use Pangea and I like to use Rapashi as well. Now, all the animals here, they all get a nice mixture of all of them so they aren't just stuck on one thing. We do tend to find animals that are stuck on primarily Pangea will only ever eat Pangea. So that's why it's important here that we just do a nice kind of like mix around. So how do we kind of make this up? So on the back of the packets, there will be instructions on how to do it. But for the most part, I kind of like a viscousy, thick kind of mixture. So what I would do is 2 parts water to 1 part, 1 and a bit part, sorry, of the pre-mixed stuff. So literally just pop it in your receptacle of whatever you're doing, pop your water in, mix it all around, and away you go. If you've got multiple crested geckos or multiple geckos that will eat this kind of diet, then they do kind of like the squidgy bottles that I would just probably just leave in the fridge. So make up a big batch, pop it in the fridge, and away you go. So another topic that's linked with this. So people don't supplement, which I find quite weird. They just forget to supplement or don't supplement their crested geckos because they think that it's got most of it in like the done mixtures of food and stuff. We would still recommend that you do use your calcium and multivitamin powders so you can do this on the insects. Now, people say, how do you put the insects in there with them on and that kind of thing? Quite simple. What I tend to do is just get a sandwich bag, whack your insects in there, get your calcium powder, pop it in there, give it a good all shake about so all of your insects are nice and coated in your calcium and multivitamin powders, and then I pop it in the enclosure. Now, with Cresties, because they're like a crepuscular, nocturnal kind of weird species, basically awake during more nighttime, I will tend to do this later on in the day than I would something like a bearded dragon, where I would do it near enough as soon as like we kind of like wake up, that kind of thing. Just make sure that the animals do have access to the calcium multivitamin powders and make sure they have access to live food as well. So another commonly asked question that we get here is how big do these animals actually get? Now, crested geckos you will tend to find get around about 18 to 25 centimeters, there or thereabouts. Some may get a little bit larger than that, some may get a little bit smaller, but on average it's around about 18 to 25 centimeters. So that is from the nose to the actual tail. So speaking of the tail, these guys can lose their tails. So when you're picking them up, just make sure that you are picking up by their body and in like kind of like a scooping motion, and you're not picking them up by the tail because it will detach and they will lose it. It's not really a big deal if they do lose it. So you tend to find that quite a lot of wild individuals will have things like missing tails, battle scars, that type of thing. So when they do lose their tails, they're kind of like colloquially called frog butts. So looks like a little bit like a frog butt. So yeah. Unlike other geckos as well, these guys do not grow their tails back. So leopard geckos grow theirs back. These guys, they don't. Once it's gone, it's gone. So moving on to items not to buy. So we tend to find that crested geckos always have these like really weird bulbs marketed towards them. So like blue bulbs, green bulbs, moon bulbs, that kind of thing. So just don't do it. Let that animal have a nice day and night cycle. So even if it emits a little bit of light to you, it could potentially be like Blackpool illuminations to that animal. So don't be popping moon bulbs or anything like that in there. Let them, everything cool down on a night time. They don't need light on a night. You'll be absolutely fine. And that about wraps us up for today. So thank you very much if you've stayed here all the way to the end of the video. If you did like the video, please make sure that you give us a like, share, and a subscribe. If you want any more content ideas, please feel free to get in contact with us. Our socials are linked down below. You can also pop them in the comment section if you'd like to. But yeah, on that bombshell, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.